as a confirmed horror nerd, I spend a significant amount of time thinking about The Walking Dead.
So I like it. I'm just wondering, what do you think of it? What do you think it's saying?
Yeah, I think it's great, and I think it's great in part because I think it actually, if I was writing Monsters in America right now, one of the things that I would add in the discussion of Walking Dead is that while generally zombie narratives, of course, as you know, are interpreted as extensions of the American obsession with apocalyptic.
Yeah.
That this is kind of part of a trajectory, going back to the 1970s, thanks, Hal Lindsey, coming all the way up to, maybe a name you haven't thought of in a while, and coming all the way up to, Left Behind and that kind of thing. But I also think a lot of zombie narratives are, The Walking Dead in particular, are reactions to sort of subversions, rearrangements of the apocalyptic narrative, because it's sort of like, okay, we've been left behind with zombies. the world as we knew it, is gone. Now what do? And part of what happens is you try to negotiate the creation of new kinds of communities, new kinds of human communities. You try to figure out what is left after what everything you assumed is so stable, everything that sort of holds our society and that we think of as making our lives secure after all of that's gone. So I think it kind of works as this interesting arena, this very sort of secular apocalypse, robbed of a lot of the religious apocalyptic, and a way to then talk about what happens after.
Yeah.
What do you think about?
Well,
Are you watching?
I've been watching
Dead?
it. Yeah, I've been watching it. I just saw the latest episode. Are you guys watching this thing?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm like you. I'm a big fan of the zombie genre, and I think it's a pretty smart series in general. I think it's. I agree with you that they're basically having some fun with this apocalyptic narrative, and also I think there's the newest version of it is this continuation of the sort of Hal Lindsey insight that you mentioned, is that now the survivalism generally is bigger than ever, and the great fear is that that in some sense, a dirty bomb or even like an electromagnetic sort of signal could, sort of some cheap terrorism could actually knock out the grid. And once you've knocked out the grid, then your neighbors will slowly become, the zombies are surrogates, for what it's going to be like when you can't get food and you've got limited resources. And I think there's a lot of tie-in going on there, like how will you survive it, and then the financial crisis, is sort of playing into this too, because if the financial system collapses, then we're not going to have food in the stores, and we're not going to have money in the banks, and before you know it, it's going to be real Walking Dead with, but it'll be real people, So I think a lot of that is happening too. And then maybe we should talk more about, like, what is the zombie, how would you contrast it with, like, the other great monsters of the era, like the vampires? So you talk about this a little bit. I wonder if you could say a word about it.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, I actually tie them together. I mean, I think there's a reason that they're sort of the reigning monsters right now, and I think both of them in different ways connect to our obsessions with the body. I think it's no accident that sort of the trajectory of zombie and vampire popularity goes right along with the plastic surgery revolution of the 1980s, the explosion of diet culture. On the one hand, you've got this monster that is, this image of perpetual life and beauty. On the other, you've got this monster that's everything that we don't want to be. Decaying, rotting corpses that eat all the time. That are literally eating machines. And so, I mean, to me, I think it makes a lot of sense. Why? I mean, it's interesting. I think in a lot of discussion of both vampires and zombies, it's almost as if before True Blood, there wasn't this fascination. Before Walking Dead, there wasn't this. And I think it's actually part of a much larger cultural arc. I mean, Anne Rice was creating, you know, sort of eroticized, incredibly beautiful, brooding vampires way back in the 1970s, you know. So that's not new. And I think both also, try to make the point, both I think are triggered in a way by the trauma of Vietnam. And there's some very, particularly with the zombie genre, there's some very direct connections there. Some of you may know that Tom Savini, George Romero's makeup artist, essentially after Night of the Living Dead, was a combat photographer in Vietnam, and Savini has talked about the fact that he has attempted to recreate some of the things that he saw in Vietnam in those films. So yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of some of the traumas of American history working itself out.
Yeah, is it too early? I know you historians like to have like several decades between the analysis and the event, but is it too early to ask you about? I mean, there seems like there's an uptick in what I call in my book sort of this torture porn stuff. Other people have sort of invented this term, and I'm just wondering, is 9/11 a trigger for some of this sort of latest genre, which is really pretty sadistic stuff? Have you given some thought to what 9/11 has produced?
Yeah, absolutely. I talk about it in connection with the popularity of Dexter. I think is sort of part of this. This idea of needing to take out the garbage, and this sort of the monster that's not really the monster, but monstrous deeds in the side of some infinite justice, to quote George Bush. And I think Dexter is especially interesting in this, but just because, I mean, much of his audience, much of the audience for that show, it tends to be educated, progressive, and yet is sort of siding with this narrative voice of the serial killer, and letting that sort of work out this notion of odd notion of justice, in society.
I actually, my take on this is sort of more in the book is more Freudian and psychologically based, and I try to make this argument that these characters who go outside the sort of routine constraints and limitations of society and just act on their own sort of desires and will, we secretly want to be these people. So even if they, if Dexter's a good example, because all of us are living these lives of quiet repression. On the way here, I think I would have killed somebody on the road if I could have, but I stopped myself because I'm civilized. But then these narratives help us sort of with this psychological catharsis. We get to go identify with somebody who's just mopping the floor with his enemies, and then we get this little holiday for the id, and then we get back to our lives of quiet repression after that.
Yeah.
So that's my
No, I've actually been thinking recently. I've even come up with a name for it. Well, there's all these narratives of subverted normalcy out there, and it kind of dates back in a way to The Sopranos, but you see it also in Weeds. You see it in Breaking Bad. This sort of idea that, on the one hand, you can kind of hold on to this kind of normal bourgeois sort of existence, and then you can also unleash the beast, in this other kind of way. So, I think something like that's going on with Dexter too.
And then I wonder too, based on this, I'm thinking there's a sense in which even the system has been. There's a tradition of demonizing the system, not just the individual monster, but the Big Brother. It's the Matrix, it's the Skynet, it's somehow the system itself is monstrous and we're trapped in it, like flies in a web or something.
Right. Sort of like the popularity of gangster films in the 1930s, and this sort of reaction against the Great Depression, and that kind of thing, and Al Capone saying, how can you convict me when all these bankers, lost everybody's savings, right? So, maybe there's something very similar happening. One other thing I was thinking